So this is a video about the second book of Aristotle's Ethics. Um, it's a very short book, but it's really important to get a lot of its details straight right now before you move on to the rest, because in this book he's going to talk specifically about virtue, how it's a mean, that it's a mean in relationship to us, as directed by practical judgment. So in the first book, we talked about how he finds the name of happiness to sort of describe the highest good for an individual, and that happiness is the name for the human work of being human when we do it seriously and well. And he said that happiness is an activity in accordance with virtue, well and good. That was persuasive, but now we have a problem. We need to know what this virtue or excellence is. So book 2 explains this. For your purposes, for your notes, the definition is in chapter 6. And the most important thing to get straight about virtue from this entire book for you is that virtue is not going to be a simple average. It's not just like a mish or like a rough center for the purposes of action, but a very, very precise, tailor-made mean point for you, a kind of a balance or a center of gravity to you as a person as you weigh complicated situations and choices. So that's where we're headed, but we have a couple of things to get straight from chapters 1 through 5. It's very valuable to have virtue as the specific difference of what happiness is, because we tend to talk about happiness in a very, very vague and loose way. We're not really sure what it is. Is it a state of mind? Is it just sort of a contentment, a vague sort of stoic peace, or is it something like feelings of euphoria that come very rarely? Is it a mood? Is it a feeling? Is it something you do? Is it a goal you achieve and then it goes away? And it's really hard to know what kind of thing it is. So that's part of what the mean is supposed to make clear for us, is just what is the kind of thing that virtue is. So first, in chapter 1, we have to deal with this question of whether or not virtue is by nature. There are virtues or excellences of thinking. We'll talk about those in book 6. But for now, we're talking about the virtues of character. And so we want to know, on the top of page 22, whether or not it's just simply part of our biological construction that we have these virtues or not. His example on page 22 is, it's clear from this that none of the virtues of character comes to be present in us by nature, since none of the things that are by nature can be habituated to be otherwise. For example, a stone, which by nature falls downward, could not be habituated to fall upward, not even if one were to train it by throwing it upward 10,000 times, which is a great example. So I think a lot of times your way into this debate, where you've sort of heard these issues raised before, is when you ask like whether a person is the way they are by nature or by what we say nurture. Is a person good or bad? Like, do they commit excellent deeds or horrible deeds because of something natural to them, something unchanging, or is the way that they are raised? For Aristotle, the answer is sort of both, but he does want to immediately make clear that in a human, we can be organized in a different way, pushed towards one set of habits or another. We have that capacity by nature. It's natural for us to have the ability to be like shaped in this way. We aren't simply born with any kind of like pattern of our action. His example of the stone is that the stone's nature is to always fall down. It's just what it does. It does it every time. You can't stop it. But you can train someone to be more or less, you can help them learn how to be more or less angry, more or less courageous, more or less desiring for honor, more or less ambitious. So there are things that we can do. So the next part of his the next part of his argument is that trying to think about the way in which virtue is related to pleasure and pain, these basic things that many organisms feel, but he calls them a kind of a yardstick, that many people take them as a kind of a yardstick for our actions. So let's think about pleasure and pain. If you look at the bottom of page 23, he starts this argument that's based on an analogy to health and to gymnastic exercise, just athletic exercise for you. Let's see, it's 1104A11. He says, first, then, one must recognize that things such as virtues are of such a nature as to be destroyed by deficiency and by excess, as we see in the case of strength and health. For excessive gymnastic exercises, as well as deficient ones, destroy one's strength. And similarly, drink or food, when they come to be too much or too little, destroy one's health, while proportionate amounts produce, increase, and preserve these. So the idea is, like, in class, we'd spend a lot more time on this, but when you exercise, if you don't exercise at all, you sort of destroy the health of your body, right? If you really just sat in a room and never walked at all, it would just organically make you worse with respect to strength. On the other hand, so the deficiency destroys the body. On the other hand, the excess destroys it as well. A fun example is if people get really into extreme athletic training, like CrossFit can sometimes be an example. It's very, very possible to overtrain, to push yourself too hard. And then that destroys the body as well. Like you start to get injuries, your metabolism goes haywire, your relationship to food gets messed up. And then you can't like, you're no longer at peak performance if you push yourself too much. So that's the idea that excess and deficiency destroy just this very obvious, visible aspect of ourselves, our health. The same is true of food and drink. It's clear that if we don't eat anything at all, we're destroying ourselves biologically. In women, if you don't eat enough, your body starts to grow excess body hair because you're literally starving yourself so you get cold. So like your body wants to make fur to keep you from freezing to death. You gotta eat. On the other hand, the excess of food, it is like if you feel like overfull and you do that consistently to yourself, you feel kind of like heavy and you have a hard time digesting, so you have like digestion pains. Excess food just sort of like pushes you out of balance. So the question would be, okay, so those are fairly reasonable. We can convince ourselves that that's true just biologically of ourselves as organisms. Then would that be the same way for things like temperance? That's like eating the right amount or drinking the right amount at the right time, or courage, which would be fearing the things that are fearful and not fearing the things that are not fearful at the right time and the right respect. So ask yourself about pleasure and pain. Try to think through that as like, it becomes sort of like a technical categories for him. When you feel fear, excess fear at something, it is painful. It is painful to feel too much fear. It sort of destroys you. You sort of lie down, you can't move. The idea is like, just like too much food or too much exercise, too much fear destroys you biologically in this way that is also a problem for our ethical qualities or our excellences of character. Thinking about what examples would help you at this point. At the top of page 24, he says, someone who runs away from and fears everything and endures nothing becomes cowardly. Running away from everything that is fearful, enduring nothing, so standing up to nothing, it makes a habit in you. It makes a pattern of choices in you that sort of adhere to you and become part of yourself. You gain the habit or the condition of being a scaredy cat, you could say. Eventually, in our next reading, he's going to talk about how Courage definitely involves fearing things that are worth fearing, and sometimes acting in that classic pattern that sitcom writers love to give us, doing something that you find to be really scary to do, and doing it anyway. But that is obviously part of courage and part of bravery. However, it's also necessary to sort of school yourself to try to really assess risk and really see what things are worth getting scared about and what are not. Um, so temperance is just his name, and we'll talk more about this in the next reading. Somebody's relationship to pleasures, specifically of the body. If you always indulge the pleasures that you feel towards food and drink, and just like pleasures of touch, then you become out of whack in the same way that the person who ate too much feels kind of like bloated and full of gas. Yourself, the rest of you, the part that organizes you, your reason, your self-understanding of your relationship to your emotions and your personality, that's the thing that can get distorted by these strange relationships to things like desire for pleasure, things like fear, and things like confidence, things like anger, things like our relationship to ambition, our desire to be admired by other people. All of these things can put you, all of you, out of whack in an analogous way. So in chapter 3, he makes the point that since pleasure and pain tend to be why I would be motivated to do a fearful thing or not, or eat something that's pleasant to me, even though I know it to be bad for me, whatever virtue is going to turn out to be, when I get to an excellent state, I will be pained and feel pleasure at the right things at the right time in the right respect. And that's what it would mean to be happy. That I think is like a really strong rhetorical selling point for you, is that if you could organize your life and all the pleasures and pains that you feel towards various activities, then you would be sort of at work in a harmonious way, in a much more complicated way than the Stoic way. You'd be sort of perfectly live to every situation, being able to make a judgment about it, a good judgment, a serious judgment, and then feel accordingly. You'd never be pulled out by your desire not to get out of bed, or your desire to let yourself go and yell at someone too much. If you could imagine a world where that would be the case, that would be excellence. And that's what it would mean to be happy. That I think it makes more clear why happiness would be the truth of us, and also why it would be desirable. So one problem arises with this, though, is that he keeps asking in these first opening chapters, like, what makes us courageous? What makes us temperate? And his answer that he keeps coming back to again and again is that it's only the practice of these very qualities that we can achieve these very qualities, which is slightly paradoxical. But you can only become courageous by doing courageous deeds. You can only become temperate by restraining from pleasure, which is bad, which is hard, because like, if you don't have that quality, how can you restrain yourself and become temperate if you're not already used to it? So it is a really difficult state. So human beings tend to think that philosophizing and taking refuge in talk, this is the top of page 27, will make you a serious person. But in fact, it makes you like a sick person who listens to the doctor, but does none of the things that they order. So the way to virtue is through action and choice. Not some kind of understanding, not like a knowledge of a formula, but actually having built up throughout a lifetime the kinds of careful judgments about yourself and your relationship to situations that leaves a residue of habit, a persona in you that is you. You become that. You become a person with virtues or a person with vices. And the vicious person is unhappy not so much because they are morally bad or that they feel guilty, but they feel full of pain and full of different fears and weird dependence on pleasure. And it just makes them feel sick, morally sick, you could say. So what we have to do is to listen to the doctor the philosopher perhaps, but also take the medicine, which is to say, do the deed, restrain from pleasure, push yourself towards a fearful thing with confidence. So in chapter 5, he starts being more specific about what these excellences of character organize. And I really like this list at the beginning at line 1105b20. He's trying to figure out the category that all of these things fall under. He says, since there are 3 kinds of things that come to be present in the soul: feelings, predispositions, and active conditions, virtue would have to be one of these. So we'll talk about each one of these words. Feelings is the most obvious, right? He means roughly the same thing that we do. By feelings, I mean, he says, desire, anger, fear, confidence, envy, joy, affection, hatred, yearning, jealousy, pity, and generally those things which are accompanied by pleasure and pain. So ask yourself, what would be the pleasure and pain of hatred? Or what would be the pleasure and pain of jealousy? It seems like each of these feelings, we think of them as emotions, but in the Greek, they're literally a kind of suffering. Like, we suffer passions, we suffer emotions. Jealousy isn't just something that's good or bad in a neutral sense. If you're jealous of something that you want but you can't have, it's incredibly painful, and it puts you out of proportion and makes you feel kind of like sick with jealousy, we say, or sick with yearning. Okay, so then the question is, well, what if excellence is simply a mood? What if it's simply a feeling? Maybe it's just desire or anger. But he says we don't respect people, or we don't praise them for simply being angry. And we don't blame them simply for being angry. We blame them for being in a certain relationship to that anger. If we are angry in a certain way, either violently or slackly, or at the right time or the wrong time, I'm not mad at somebody for being mad. I'm mad in the way that they didn't let it go. They were angry too long. So that for him is a sign that whatever the virtue of anger would be, it wouldn't just simply be the emotion. It would be something about the way the emotion is situated and shaped, the posture of it in some kind of way in your soul, in your psyche, the shape of your habits with respect to anger, pleasure, etc. So he rejects simply that virtue would be a mood, but then maybe it's something like a predisposition, and this sort of goes back to, is virtue simply by nature question? And again, he says, no, well, we've already dealt with that. If virtue were simply a capacity that we had, like just simply like a natural ability to do something, we know that people aren't like that. We can change our relationship to pleasure. We can change our relationship to anger. We can change our relationship to hatred, to confidence, to fear. So it can't be simply a capacity. Although we do have the capacity to have a habit with respect to these things, it has to be more. It has to be something active. Only 3 things in the soul: feeling, predisposition, or capacity. And this final category, which is a little fuzzy, Sachs is trying very hard not to translate this word as habit. He wants to say that it's an active condition. So whatever virtue is, it has to be an active habit, you could say. I encourage you to look in the glossary for his reasonings for active condition. So virtue is not a feeling. It's not just a natural capacity. It's something like an active habit. It's the what accrues from a lifetime of conscious choices about bearing yourself in a certain way towards your passions and the choices you have to make, that forms in you the character that is you, that is either has some of the virtues or none of them or all. And if you have the virtues, you are set up so that you feel pain and pleasure at the right time in the right respect. And that's what carries you forward into being like having solid, long-lasting happiness. I should say that at this point, it starts to sound potentially like a hard, like a too difficult goal. Like what could a human being who is oriented towards their passions and human situations in this way really look like? Could that person really exist? And that's a helpful way to think about this is that goes back to that distinction in book 1, chapter 7, between the serious harpist and the harpist who's just messing around. We look in life not for godlike perfection, achievement at all of these excellences, but we look for somebody who's made a serious try to actually make it happen. The serious harpist isn't like a perfect harpist. All harpists make mistakes. Sometimes you forget your music. Sometimes you miss a note. But the difference, the important thing is that you tried, and you didn't just try on and off, like you were just messing around on the guitar or whatever, but you practiced, you put effort into it, you attempted to choose and to restrain your desire for pleasure, or restrain the violence of your temper. So now we're just about ready to define virtue. So take a look at chapter 6. The excellence of a horse makes it a first-rate horse, makes it good at running, at carrying its rider, holding still in the face of enemies. If that's true, then the virtue of a human being would make you, the individual human being, just excellent, good at all these things, these human situations. But here's the problem. Virtue has to be a balance in some way, not too much, not too little, but it can't be any old middle point. It has to be a middle point that's specific. So his example is starting at like 35 on page 28. For example, if 10 is a lot and 2 are few, then 6 is the mean amount for those who would be finding the average. So if you add 10 and 2 together and then you split that in half, 12, you get 6, because it exceeds and is exceeded by an equal amount. And that's just the average that you do with arithmetic. So the problem is maybe the excellence of human is like that. Maybe if I could just like on average figure out how long I should be angry, 5 minutes, and then just like always cut it off, then I'll have excellence at anger. But the problem is it doesn't work like that. He says the mean in relationship to us can't be taken in this way. And his example is about athletic training again. If 10 pounds is a lot for someone to eat and 2 pounds a little, then the gymnastic trainer will prescribe 6 pounds on this false model. For even this would be a lot for someone who is going to take it, or a little. So if 10 pounds of food would be too much food and 2 pounds a little, should I make you eat 6 pounds because that's the arithmetic midpoint of food? That's not going to work because it might not be the right amount for you. For some people that would be a ton of food. 6 pounds actually sounds like a ton of food. But if you were Milo, a famous wrestler, so like this great bodybuilder, 6 pounds of food, it's not enough food for him. He needs like 8 pounds or maybe even 10. It would just come down to his individual temperament. So this has to be the case with avoiding too much and too little. We know that too much and too little always destroy us, and it's most obvious when the extreme destroys us, an extreme too much, an extreme too little. But to find virtue, when you feel pity or feel confidence or feel desire, you have to find the midpoint that works for your, that is the balance point of your own temperament. So one example that I think will help is say, okay, so courage is defined by being a mean with respect to your own temperament, with respect to the passions of fear and confidence. So some people seem to have a personality that is naturally very, very confident. And some people seem to have just be born that way. They seem to have a personality that's just a little fearful. They're quiet people, and a lot of things bother them. So whatever courage would look like, whatever mean point for the naturally confident person, and the midpoint for the naturally fearful person, it will simply look different. If the fearful person can push themselves towards confidence as much as possible is for them, they might still look often slightly less confident than the really bold guy, the aggressive guy, but they would still have found the midpoint for them. And the same would be true, like the naturally confident person needs to pull himself back and not jump into profoundly dangerous situations because he's too confident about his ability to do them. His courage will be the balance point for him that balances out his need to feel a little bit more fear. He needs to be slightly fearful because it's smart to be afraid of the things that are actually bad. So virtue can't be an average. You would always be missing the balance point for you if you just made some kind of weird abstract calculation about how you should roughly be in every situation. Aristotle gives a nice list on page 29, roughly around 1106b20. He says, you have to experience all these passions as a reaction to the situation you're in, to feel them when you ought, towards the people you ought, for the reasons for the sake of which as you ought, and in the manner you ought. All of those sort of conditions would be what was actually the mean. It has to be at the right time, the right place, not to the wrong people, not too long, not too short, for the right reasons, doing it consciously, doing it on purpose, doing it being motivated well and not by like lesser motivations. If you could make those choices in the right situation to the best of your serious power of judgment, then you would be virtuous. If you had done it over the course of a life and had managed to secure that as a habit and a part of you, that would be you as excellent, and that would be you as happy. So therefore, definition 1107a, virtue is an active condition that makes one apt at choosing, consisting in a mean condition in relation to us, which is determined by a proportion and by the means by which a person with practical judgment would determine it. So the way I like to think about it is if you're trying to find like a center of gravity for like an irregular solid, an irregular solid would have all kinds of like weird like things jutting off of it. But if you find exactly, you can calculate the precise center of gravity for the weird irregular solid. That point would be different for every irregular solid, but it would be the point that balanced it. Like if you hang a string from something center of gravity, it'll like sit perfectly and not like go like this. If you could do that, that's what would be what excellence would be like in the psyche. So if you take a look at chapter 7, there's a big list of all the virtues. Some of them will sound familiar, and he starts with the most familiar one. Courage is a virtue. It is a mean balance point with respect to your own temperament, with respect to fear and confidence. Everyone knows that. Courage is good. We respect people who are brave. We also respect people who are temperate with respect to pleasure and pain. More on that in the next reading. It looks like there's some dispositions about money. Everyone knows that generosity is good. He's going to talk about a special kind of relation to money called magnificence. But I think you almost see what he's trying to say a little bit more clearly if you start to get into the weirder virtues. Greatness of soul, a mean with respect to honor. So what you can say in English is like your balance point with respect to ambition. Too much ambition destroys you. Too little ambition also destroys you. Mean point for you, that would be excellence. Some of these virtues don't have a name. Mean point with respect to anger. Not too much anger, not too little, at the right time, in the right respect, for the right reasons. Not every passion has a virtue. He tries to sort of like limit it to things that sort of form broad patterns in our life or like important like not linchpins, but like important balance points in a human soul. So take a look at the list of 11. He's going to go through each of these in more detail over the next couple of books. But make for your notes, it's good to know that the list of virtues is in chapter 7, book 2. So the last point here that's important in the last chapter. Well, sorry, 2 points. One of the oddities of this particular, if a human being can be organized better or worse in a mean relationship to their own passions and reactions to situations they find, it's going to change someone's perception of other people depending on where they are with respect to a particular excellence. So if courage is our example, and he says he's going to say that what is this not going to work? Maybe it will. It's going to be backwards. So you're just going to have to imagine it. If the person is not excellent and they're way overconfident, they will look at the person who is very fearful as definitely being very fearful, but they'll also look at the person who is truly courageous, who's balanced fear and confidence, and they'll see them and they'll think that guy is lame. He's way too fearful, because he'll seem more fearful than the overconfident person. And the person who's way too fearful will also completely hate the overconfident person, but they'll also be confused about the guy with the actual virtue, because they'll look at the person who's a balance with fear and confidence, and they'll say that person is way too overconfident, because they themselves are not at the mean point. My fun example for this is like, if you don't have excellence, human excellence, it's almost like you're in a fun house with all those distorting mirrors. You keep trying to look and observe other people to see what they're like, what their character is like, what their personality is. And if you're not balanced within you, you'll be constantly making wrong judgment calls about other human beings. So not only does virtue balance you, it also balances your ability to judge other people and situations. In a bit, baby.
Well, I did all the
Babe, I'll check on you when I'm finished. I'm almost done. So virtue makes your sight of others more clear. And I think it would explain a lot, like if none of us are very virtuous, and it turns out that Aristotle points out most of us don't even get to, we're not even vicious, we're just kind of like a model of human qualities. If most people's vision of other people is distorted by a lack of excellence, that would explain a lot about just ordinary facts of life, why the world seems so morally ambiguous and why so many people disagree about important things. It's because our vision is distorted. We haven't managed to push ourselves towards the mean for us. So the last step in this argument is Aristotle says, for the love of what's holy, find your temperament. If you are the person who's more afraid of pain, or the person who's more afraid of pleasure, have more trouble with pleasure or more trouble with pain, and you have to steer yourself towards the opposite side. It's that like pushing yourself towards the thing that you're not good at. That'll help you get to the midpoint. You have to overstep the midpoint in order to actually get to the middle. So if you're very fearful, you're going to have to push yourself towards confidence, which will feel like too much because you don't start there. And if you're very confident, if you're very overconfident, you have to actually push yourself to be a little bit more fearful. So it's like a boat. If you've ever steered a boat, push against the current. It's really hard, but that's the only way that you could drag yourself into a way that could be straightened, like a bent piece of lumber has to be straightened towards the mean. All right, so that's book 2. And he's about to make it more concrete in the next couple of books and describe how all of these really important aspects of virtue play out in individual virtues.